We are now.
Okay, so Hani's question just now was about how the morphotactic component decides which to keep, okay? And just to go through this very briefly, we can make a comparison with phonotactics, where many languages don't allow two vowels to be next to each other in so-called hiatus contexts. And one of the things that happens is that some languages will delete the first vowel, some languages will delete the second vowel, some languages will fuse the vowels into a coalesced thing so that ah and oo, if one word ends with ah and the next word begins with oo, might become o. In other languages, they might always keep ah because it's more sonorous, regardless of whether it's in vowel 1 or vowel 2. And in other languages, it may be the case that they always keep the second vowel because there's a preference for vowels at the beginning of words or at the beginning of morphemes as opposed to the end. So in short, we expect, in a sense, the same type of variation in repairs to the same kind of constraint in morphotactics that we find in phonotactics. And that's one of the things I want to convince you of. So some of you may be aware that, of course, there are people who say, aren't I lucky? Fine, we've just been talking about that. Now there's a very important dialect survey of the British Isles that revealed that in, I believe, somewhere in the Northumbria area, there are people who say, I am lucky, but in the context of suddenly having to do negation under C, instead of saying, aren't I lucky, we'll say, isn't I lucky? But they don't say, I is lucky. Okay? So to me, what this suggests is that these people are deleting a different set of features. Okay? We didn't put the full set of features on here, but you can intuitively think of it in the following sense, that the people who say, aren't I lucky, are deleting features in such a way that you end up with the most underspecified item. So in fact, you probably end up deleting number as well. Whereas the people who say, isn't I lucky, are deleting the person features, but leaving number, and so you're getting a third person form. So how does the morphotactics decide what to delete? That really is an interesting point of variation among languages, and you can even find dialects of the same language that resolve things differently. So, in a sense, you know, we find in phonotactics, and I hope to show you a variety of cases in morphotactics, where impoverishment rules can be thought of as a response to a particular morphotactic constraint, but that constraint can be resolved a variety of ways. If a language says, look, I do not like having alpha and beta next to each other, you can solve that by deleting alpha, you can solve that by deleting beta, you can solve that by deleting both. In fact, if it says, I don't like having plus alpha and minus beta next to each other, you might think you could solve that by changing the values of one of alpha and beta. So, you know, there are many options there, and your question is very good. Do you have any follow-ups on that?
In the case of M and R, it seems that in the morphotactics deleted the features that are not in M. So, what features that are similar in M is retained and the rest are deleted. Yes.
But actually, you know, we can't tell, right? Because going from aren't to aren't, we don't know how much is deleted, because the paradigm is already sparse as it is, right? Do you see what I'm saying? We have 6 potential places in the paradigm, and we delete, and we went from 1, but actually since R has such a heterogeneous distribution, we don't know if we went to 2, 4, 3, or 6. All of the results would be the same. Okay? It's probably simplest to think that you went to either 2 or 3. Or maybe you went to none of those. You went to something that's 0. And 0, in fact, has the pronunciation that the elsewhere item would have. Okay? So the paradigm in English is not rich enough to tell us that. Now let me show you one other case that helped get you thinking about this, okay? And this is actually the case that originally motivated Bonnet to work on impoverishment. Similar case. And now we're going to see data from another language. All right? Take a deep breath. Now, many languages have what we talked about before in class as pronominal clitics. Pronominal clitics are a kind of marker on the verb that is co-referent with, usually in the cases that I'll show you, a topicalized item. So similarly in English, the way you could say, rain, I don't like it. Okay? Or you could do something maybe perhaps more elaborate, like you could say, as for the toy train, as for Freddie, I didn't give it to him. And then it is understood as the toy train, and him is understood as Freddie, and you topicalize and then you kind of resume with these little markers. Okay? And many languages like Greek and so forth have this property as well. Now, these clitics which resume topicalized items usually will have the same features as the items they topicalize. So let's go to Spanish now. If you say something like, the horse, yeah? I sold it yesterday. Okay? So here we have the horse, and that's masculine, third person singular. And actually, it's also would correspond to an accusative argument, because it's the object of the verb to sell. And then we get this pronominal clitic here, which goes actually before the verb, but is an accusative clitic. Okay? You guys follow? I know it's a new language that you may not all speak, but this is the horse. It I sold yesterday, where the it has the same features as the hanging topic. Masculine, third person singular, accusative. Okay? So actually, let's write out the features that this lo would correspond to. We can say that lo realizes a D that is pronominal and is singular and is accusative. Okay, so we're going to call that minus nominative, and let's call that also, for the present purpose, minus dative. And it's going to be minus participant and minus author, and it's going to be, well, that's all we'll say about it for now. Okay. Fine? All right. Now, let's have a different sentence. To Pedro. I sold him the horse yesterday. To Pedro, that's going to be masculine, third person singular. But it's going to be dative, because that's the indirect object of the verb to sell. Okay. So now our dative is going to look like this. It's going to look exactly the same as the one we just wrote, except for the case features are going to be different. It's going to be a pronominal, it's going to be singular, it's going to be minus nominative, but it's going to be plus dative, and it's going to be third person. Okay? So far so good? Alright, now let's make things fun by topicalizing both of those things. Let's try to say, to Pedro the horse, I sold him it yesterday. Okay. A Pedro el caballo, I'm going to put I sold yesterday, and now what goes here based on everything that I've told you so far? What should go there? No points off, no demotions, no extra for guessing. Lay low, very good guess. And that should be what happens. According to the elsewhere principle, that should be what happens. This should go here, this should go there. Very good guess. You're well on your way to being a good Spanish grammarian. But in fact, what is actually pronounced there is something completely different. Celo. And you say, what is say? And of course you could not have used say in the other context I showed you. That's something very specific to this context. What is it? Say is another pronominal clitic that's used, and it's an elsewhere item. It's used, let's put that on the board. I'm going to claim that say, the features of say are just something that's pronominal. That's it. It's an elsewhere item. And where is it used? Well, it's used in a variety of contexts in Spanish. It's used in impersonals, it's used in reflexives, it's used in reciprocals, it's used all over the place. It's very heterogeneous. And so it's an elsewhere item which should lose the competition because it's less specific than this. But in this case, it's winning the competition. Why? Because by hypothesis, before the envelope even gets to the exponent list, something has changed in those terminals. And specifically, we can imagine that the two clitics that are next to each other, forming overall part of a larger word, with the verb, this one having a specific set of features like minus participant, minus author, minus singular, and then a specific set of case features. In this case, it's going to be the accusative, so minus nominative, minus dative. And this one having another set of case features like minus participant, minus author, minus singular, minus nominative, plus dative. That something in the morphotactics doesn't like having these two things next to each other. Now what could it be? What might the morphotactics not like about having these two things next to each other? Yes.
It's because of the case. One is minus dative and one is dative.
I haven't given you enough information, actually, to know. So that is a reasonable hypothesis. You could say it's maybe because of the case of those things, but what's interesting is that this seems to be, again, something that's morphotactic. It doesn't seem to be a problem with the... It's really a problem about those two clitics with those two sets of features being next to each other. Now, what could it be? What do you notice about those two bundles next to each other, the way I've written? You've emphasized the way that they're different. What else do you notice about them?
They share lots of features.
They're very similar, actually. They're very, very, very similar. Now, how many of you have noticed, when I was giving my little mini spiel about I and ow, how I pronounce this word? You noticed. I said diphthong. Of course, what should I have said, being a good, Greek?
Diphthong.
Diphthong. I never say diphthong. I never say th next to each other. Why not? Too similar. These are two voiceless fricatives. They're very similar. So what do? I dissimilate. I have a constraint in my phonotactics that disallows th. Now interestingly, German people very often say diphthong. They turn this into a T. I turn this into a P. We both have the same constraint, but they change one and I change the other. Okay? This is called dissimilation. Dissimilation. Two things very close to each other. Of course, I have no problem with a word like father. I mean, that's a different, it's not voiceless. But you know, I would have no problem with a word like father. Okay? It's not about fun, th in the same word. It's about them being right next to each other. So here we have these things which are very, very, very similar next to each other. And what I claim is that just like me saying instead of diphthong, saying diphthong, namely I delete some of the features here to make these things a little more different, that the morphotactic says delete, in this case, all of this. The result is you put in say. That's the case that Bonnet used to motivate impoverishment. So now we've seen two cases of impoverishment. One with amt and one with this lelo. Both of these things not existing. And I told you that in both cases the reason was not phonological, but was morphotactic. That here it's because negation added to the overall markedness and said simplify that thing. And here we had dissimilation. So now we're starting to see how different features that the syntax is very nice enough to generate and put in an envelope and send, sometimes that envelope is too heavy. And even though syntax did a great job putting it together, in between the output of syntax and even before the exponent list has time to get a chance, certain morphotactic requirements specific to specific languages, again, no problem with th for Greeks, but certain languages have certain morphotactic constraints on them, and those are resolved in different ways. And one of the specific types of resolution that we focused on today is impoverishment, which is a kind of feature deletion. And crucially, it's a feature deletion that happens after syntax and before vocabulary insertion, in that window of opportunity. Okay, questions? Questions? All right. Well, now that we've got the tool of impoverishment up our sleeve, we can start to see what it does. And one of the things that it seems to do is it deletes features. And by deleting features, we see that deleting features prevents certain exponents from ever being inserted. That's the key. Now, I want to claim that, as a result, impoverishment rules can be responsible for types of meta-syncretism. In fact, I talked to you about a meta-syncretism last time with Latin, and it was very involved. But in fact, we can think about another type of meta-syncretism, which is the following. I mentioned to you that first-person pronouns don't have gender features on them in English. You have I, which is the same for masculine and feminine. Yeah? All right, now here's an interesting thing. You don't have a distinction between I that's masculine and feminine. All right, well, you might just say that's because English just doesn't have the right vocabulary item. Tomorrow, you could invent one that was I-et. I and Iet. Or I, yeah, why not? Well, fine. But guess what? It also doesn't have a distinction in gender for me. Now we're noticing that not only does it not have it for I, it doesn't have it for me. It doesn't have it for we. It doesn't have it for us. And that's another metasyncretism. Okay? It's not just that the potential difference between masculine and feminine is not being found in the nominative. It's also not being found in the accusative. It's also not being found in the plural. It's not being found for any of these cases that seem to involve the author. So we could say, look, the vocabulary items of English are just not rich enough to express this. But then we're losing a generalization, which is that it's never found. Not for I, not for me, not for we, not for us, not for our. None of these. Even though we have his and her, why don't we have my and myedai? Right? Why don't we have a different, you could imagine, why not? Doesn't happen. So this seems to be something which is enforced throughout English. There seems to be a constraint against a distinction in gender for any case of the author. That's a morphotactic constraint that holds throughout English, and it's not specific to it's not specific to any exponent. It's a generalization that holds of all exponents. It's a meta-syncretism, a potentially different expression of gender for the first person is not happening anywhere. And that's not a property of I being just, we're just missing the right word, and if one day some clever child would come up with the word, we could have it. No. It seems to be enforced. Now, interestingly, we can say, that's because there's a rule that deletes it. There is a rule that deletes it, that says delete the feature plus or minus feminine on any terminal that includes plus author. You guys following along? That will guarantee that no exponent can ever distinguish gender in the first person. Even if a child were to invent one, this rule would prevent it from ever being used. Okay. Now, any questions? All right. Now, you speak Greek. How do you say I am happy? Now, how would you say that if you were a woman?
The same. Είμαι ευτυχισμένη.
Okay. Okay. Did you hear that? Είμαι
ευτυχισμένος.
One more time.
Ευτυχισμένος.
Ευτυχισμένος. And if it's masculine?
Ευτυχισμένη.
Ευτυχισμένη. Now, where is that gender coming from? It's not on the pronoun, is it?
No.
The pronoun is
pronouns for first.
The pronoun is the same in both cases. Even if you were to say ego, say it.
Εγώ είμαι ευτυχισμένος. Εγώ είμαι ευτυχισμένη.
You see, you have an ego, ego. It's nice in Greek that these simple words have these grand meanings. Like the word for, big is mega, and the word for I is ego, and the word for small is micro. And anyway, all these words that have these nice scientific meanings in English. They're just regular old words. Greek, okay. So, but the word ego, I, is going to be the same, even though the gender is going to be different on the adjective. How does that work? If we say that the ego doesn't have feminine on it, how is that triggering gender agreement? What do you guys think? Okay, so we have a pronoun and we have an adjective. We know that in the end of the day, the pronoun is going to be pronounced ego, which means I, and doesn't have a gender feature on it. We know at the end of the day, the adjective is going to be pronounced in a way that is specific. It's either going to be plus feminine or minus feminine. How does that work?
Well, if we've got a deletion rule, then if we assume that applies before the deletion, that applies after assigning, or doing some sort of matching of the gender feature of the adjective and the pronoun, then it will
Very
do,
good.
right?
Very good. In other words, the problem, what I'm saying here, and you're exactly right, the problem with having gender on a first-person pronoun in Greek and English and all of these languages is not syntactic. That's perfectly fine as far as the syntax is concerned. In fact, it has to be. The problem is later. It's morphotactic. But in the syntax, there is gender on first person. And how do we know? It's there in the case of the feminine, with the "is" ending, right? Right?
Yeah.
The "e" ending. It's there in the syntax. We have agreement between the pronoun and the adjective, which involves copying these features over to here. And now everything is done, and this gets sent off to turn it into phonology. And after that has happened and the agreement has happened, at that point, this gets deleted here. But it stays intact here. And that gets pronounced as E here. This rule applies here, deletes that, and this gets pronounced as ego. So in other words, we know that feminine was there on the first person pronoun because it had to have been there in order to get it on the adjective. So this is a case of what you might call sometimes called derivational opacity. We had a feature on A, and we didn't have that feature on B. Then the feature was copied from A to B. It was on both A and B. And then it was only on B. Right? But we know that the only way it can ever get on B is from A. And so we have to assume that it got on B because it was on A and wasn't on B in the first place and started on A, was copied to B, but then was deleted in its original place on A in response to a morphotactic constraint. You guys following that? Right. Questions? No? All right. very much. See you next week.
Sure.
I think I should do credits at the end.